History books often tell us that great empires crumble under the deafening roar of siege engines, or the terrifying clash of iron upon iron on blood-soaked battlefields. They speak of fire and fury. But tonight, as the world around you grows quiet, we are going to open a different kind of chapter. A chapter where the slow, inevitable fracture of the mighty Roman Empire did not begin with a sword, but with something as fragile as a peppercorn slipping from a weary merchant's hand into the golden sands of a Syrian desert. Before we journey back across the centuries, I invite you to make yourself comfortable. Pull your blanket a little tighter around your shoulders. Let the tension in your jaw completely melt away. Allow your breathing to slow down, matching the steady, ancient rhythm of the earth. Close your eyes and let my voice carry you far away from the worries of today, across oceans of time to the vast, starlit expanses of the Syrian desert in the 3rd century. Imagine the profound, absolute silence of the desert night. It is a cold, piercing kind of quiet, where the only sound is the gentle, mournful whisper of the wind shifting the dunes, grain by microscopic grain. In the distance, beneath a canopy of 1 billion glittering stars, you might hear the faint, rhythmic jingling of brass bells. It is a caravan, hundreds of exhausted camels, their heavy hooves padding softly against the cooling sand, carrying the wealth of the known world. They carry bundles of shimmering Chinese silk, heavy sacks of Indian pepper, and the intoxicating, resinous scent of Arabian frankincense that lingers in the crisp night air. For weeks, these travelers have endured the punishing heat of the sun and the desolate emptiness of the wasteland. But then, on the horizon, rising like a mirage from the dust, they see it, Palmyra, the bride of the desert. To call Palmyra a mere city would be a disservice to its majesty. It was a miracle of water and stone, an emerald oasis bursting from the barren earth, where sweet, life-giving springs nurtured dense groves of date palms and pomegranate trees. In the heart of this harsh wilderness, humanity had carved out a paradise. But Palmyra was not just a sanctuary for the weary. It was the absolute center of the ancient global economy. It was the grand intersection where the mysterious, opulent East collided with the structured, ambitious West. Every ounce of spice that flavored the feasts of Roman senators, every yard of silk that draped the shoulders of empresses, had to pass through the toll gates of Palmyra. The city grew breathtakingly rich. The nomadic tribes who once pitched humble tents of goat hair were now aristocratic merchant princes. They walked down grand colonnaded streets paved with smooth limestone, their footsteps echoing softly, past towering temples dedicated to forgotten gods. They drank sweet wine from delicate, translucent glass vessels imported from distant shores, and rested their heads on pillows stuffed with the finest down. Yet, history has a quiet way of balancing its scales. Wealth, especially unimaginable wealth, gathered in the middle of nowhere, possesses a scent. It is a scent that travels further than frankincense. And in the shadowy stillness of the desert night, this intoxicating aroma of prosperity was beginning to attract the attention of apex predators. If you are lying still right now, imagine the delicate, fragile nature of a single strand of silk drawn taut between two opposing forces. That was Palmyra. To its west lay the colossal, aging machinery of the Roman Empire, a sprawling beast that demanded constant feeding to maintain its borders. To its east lurked the aggressive, resurgent Sassanid Persian Empire, hungry to reclaim the glories of its ancestors. Palmyra sat precariously in the middle, a brilliant jewel caught in a slow-closing vice. For a long time, the city survived, and even thrived, through a masterpiece of silent diplomacy. They paid their tributes to Rome, they managed the trade routes, and they kept the peace. The citizens of Palmyra believed their wealth made them untouchable. They believed the towering stone columns of the Temple of Bel would stand eternal against the shifting sands of politics. But peace in the ancient world was never a permanent monument. It was merely a pause in the wind, and as the 3rd century wore on, the wind was beginning to change direction. The Roman Empire was entering a period of catastrophic crisis, tearing itself apart from within through civil wars, plagues, an economic ruin. The giant was stumbling, and in that moment of weakness, the silent oasis of Palmyra, sensing the loosening grip of its masters, began to dream a very dangerous dream, a dream of total, absolute power. The night in Palmyra was a tapestry of hushed conversations and hidden anxieties. Behind the carved wooden doors of the merchant estates, the flickering light of oil lamps cast long, wavering shadows against the walls. The elders, men whose faces were lined like the very maps they used to navigate the wasteland, sat on Persian rugs, speaking in low, measured tones. They calculated the diminishing strength of the Roman legions. They weighed the gold in their vaults against the iron of their neighbors. The air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh and the unspoken realization that their era of quiet subservience was drawing to a close. They were no longer just middlemen. They were the gatekeepers of the world's wealth. The realization was as thrilling as it was terrifying. It is a profound tragedy of the human condition that we are rarely satisfied with peace when we possess the means to pursue supremacy. The desert, which had for centuries protected them with its vast, unforgiving emptiness, was now preparing to become a theatre of immense sorrow. But for tonight, the stars remain indifferent to the ambitions of mortals. The palm trees sway gently in the cool breeze, and the water of the Efka spring continues its eternal, soothing bubbling from the depths of the earth. Let the calm of the desert wash over you. The storm is still far away, hidden beyond the horizon. For now, there is only the night, the sand, and the slow march of time. As the gentle dawn eventually breaks over the Syrian expanse, painting the sky in soft hues of crushed violet and pale gold, the true scale of Palmyra's golden age reveals itself to the awakening sun. This was an era where the desert sands seemed to miraculously turn into solid gold. The city was a masterpiece of pale limestone, glowing warmly in the morning light. Stretching for over a kilometre, the great colonnade stood as a testament to their unimaginable prosperity. Imagine walking slowly down this grand avenue. The massive Corinthian columns, carved with intricate leaves of acanthus, reach towards the sky, casting long, cool shadows across the paved street. Beneath these grand arches, the air is thick with the mingling scents of roasting meats, exotic spices, and the sweet perfume of crushed jasmine flowers. The people of Palmyra, whose ancestors had survived by navigating the harsh, waterless dunes, now found themselves draped in the finest fabrics the world had ever seen. They wrapped themselves in delicate layers of diaphanous silk that fluttered in the warm breeze like liquid light. In the tranquil courtyards of their opulent villas, hidden behind high, protective walls, the sound of water gently splashing into marble fountains provided a constant, soothing lullaby. They reclined on couches inlaid with ivory, holding delicate cups of Roman glass so thin they seemed almost made of frozen air, filled with sweet, dark wine brought from the distant shores of the Mediterranean. It is a profound historical irony that a city born from the severe deprivation of the desert would become the very definition of indulgent luxury. Yet, beneath this serene surface of endless feasts and flowing silver, a subtle shift was occurring in the grand chessboard of the ancient world. The mighty Roman Empire, the supposed eternal master of the Mediterranean, was bleeding from 1,000 internal wounds. It was the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors were being elevated and murdered with alarming frequency. Borders were collapsing under the weight of barbarian invasions, and the economy was in a state of catastrophic freefall. The Lion of Rome was old, distracted, and limping. During this period of profound instability, Palmyra was ruled by a man named Odaenathus. He was a brilliant, pragmatic leader who saw an opportunity in Rome's weakness, not to rebel, but to make himself indispensable. When the Sassanid Persians marched westward, capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian and humiliating the empire, it was Odaenathus who rode out from the desert to shatter the Persian forces. He fought for Rome, but the victories, the spoils, and the legendary reputation were entirely his own. He became the undisputed lord of the East, holding the fragile Roman frontier together with the strength of his own cavalry. But power, much like the desert wind, is notoriously fickle. It changes direction without warning, erasing footprints and toppling empires with equal indifference. In the year 267, Odenathus was assassinated in the quiet darkness of an aristocratic gathering in 1. History whispers many rumors about who held the dagger. Some say it was a jealous relative, others suggest the long, invisible hand of a paranoid Rome. But the truth, as it so often does, vanished into the sands, leaving behind only a sudden, terrifying vacuum of power. The king was dead. The desert held its breath, waiting for the inevitable chaos to consume the oasis. However, the chaos never came. Instead, out from the velvet shadows of the royal palace, stepped a figure who would forever alter the course of history. Her name was Septimia Zenobia. She was the widow of the murdered king, but as she stood before the grieving court, there was no trace of fragile despair in her posture. Ancient historians describe her with a mixture of profound awe and deep-seated fear. She was said to possess an intellect as sharp as a newly forged blade, fluent in Greek, Aramaic, Egyptian, and Latin. She claimed to be a direct descendant of the great Cleopatra of Egypt, and she carried herself with the terrifying, absolute certainty of a woman born to rule the world. Her eyes, dark and penetrating, seemed to look right through the superficial courtesies of her advisors, calculating the exact weight of every man's loyalty. She did not merely mourn her husband, she seamlessly assumed his power, acting as regent for her young son, Vaballathus. She was an anomaly that defied every expectation of her time. She would ride for miles on horseback alongside her armored soldiers, enduring the blistering heat of the sun without a complaint, drinking with her generals, and commanding the absolute devotion of the fiercest warriors of the desert. A woman living in the middle of a parched desert, who had never once set foot in the grand marble halls of Rome, was about to make the most powerful emperor in the world lose sleep. The psychology of absolute power is a fascinating, dangerous phenomenon. It is an intoxicating poison that enters the bloodstream slowly. For years, Palmyra had been the loyal servant, the wealthy merchant who paid their taxes and fought Rome's battles, while the emperors in the West squandered the empire's strength in endless civil wars. Zenobia looked across the vast expanse of her domain. She controlled the trade routes that kept the Roman economy breathing. She commanded an army of heavy cavalry, the fearsome cataphracts, whose very presence could shake the earth. She looked at the fractured, weakening state of Rome and asked a very quiet, yet monumental question in the depths of her mind. Why should the master of the East remain a servant to the dying West? The transition from loyalty to defiance did not begin with a loud declaration of war or a dramatic burning of flags. It began with silence. It began with the slow, deliberate withholding of grain shipments. It began with the quiet reassignment of military commanders along the borders. Zenobia was not reckless. She was a chess player, meticulously arranging her pieces on the board while her opponent was looking the other way. The wealth of Palmyra was no longer just being spent on silk and wine. In the hidden courtyards and remote outposts, the gold was being melted down and hammered into armor. The peaceful merchant city was slowly, methodically transforming itself into an engine of conquest. The citizens of Palmyra, intoxicated by their own prosperity and the charismatic brilliance of their queen, began to believe that they were the true inheritors of the world. They felt invincible, protected by the vast, empty desert that surrounded them. But as the ancient philosophers knew, the moment one feels completely invincible is usually the exact moment the universe begins to orchestrate their downfall. The ambition of Queen Zenobia was a magnificent, brilliant flame burning in the dark of the 3rd century. Yet, even the brightest flames cast the longest, darkest shadows. And in those shadows, the weary, battered legions of Rome were finally beginning to turn their gaze toward the east. The cool night air of the oasis was still fragrant with the scent of jasmine, but underneath it, if one breathed deeply enough, there was the faint, metallic scent of iron. The desert was preparing for a storm unlike any it had ever seen. The crisis of the 3rd century was not merely a political disruption for the Roman Empire. It was a profound, agonizing unraveling of the known world. As emperors in Rome were assassinated by their own guards with tragic regularity, the vast borders of the empire began to bleed. The legions, once the disciplined, immovable pillars of civilization, were stretched too thin, exhausted by endless civil wars and the relentless pressure of barbarian tribes from the north. It was in this sprawling, chaotic vacuum of power that the silence of Palmyra transformed into something entirely different. It transformed into motion. Queen Zenobia did not issue dramatic declarations of war. She did not send fiery messengers to insult the Roman Senate. In the ancient world, true power rarely needed to scream to make itself known. Instead, her rebellion was a masterpiece of quiet, devastating logistics. She began by solidifying her control over the vital trade routes, ensuring that the wealth of the East remained securely within her grasp. Then, she turned her eyes toward a prize that would cripple the Roman economy completely. She looked toward the ancient, fertile valley of the Nile. She looked toward Egypt. H. If you are resting your head on your pillow right now, let your breathing synchronize with the distant, muffled thud of 1,000 heavy hooves. Try to imagine the sheer, terrifying weight of the Palmyrene cataphracts moving across the desert at dusk. These were not ordinary cavalrymen. Both the rider and the horse were entirely encased in overlapping scales of iron and bronze. They moved not like a chaotic horde, but like a slow, unstoppable river of liquid metal flowing over the sand dunes. There were no loud war cries, no reckless charges. There was only the rhythmic, metallic clinking of their armor, a sound that carried for miles in the still desert air, announcing the arrival of an inevitable force. The conquest of Egypt was swift and shockingly efficient. The Roman garrison, demoralized and neglected by a fractured leadership in the West, stood little chance against the disciplined, heavily armored veterans of the desert. When Zenobia's forces marched into Alexandria, the great intellectual capital of the ancient world, they did not burn its libraries or slaughter its philosophers. They simply occupied the granaries. By securing Egypt, Zenobia effectively placed her hand around the throat of Rome. She now controlled the primary source of wheat that fed the millions of citizens in the imperial capital. Without a single sword striking the gates of Rome, she had brought the empire to its knees. The expansion did not stop there. The silent tide of the Palmyrene army swept through the Levant, moving north into Anatolia, bringing the wealthy, ancient cities of Antioch and Ancyra under her dominion. Almost a third of the Roman Empire, its richest and most culturally vibrant provinces, had been quietly amputated and stitched onto the growing empire of the Desert Queen. In the heart of Palmyra, the atmosphere was one of intoxicating, dizzying triumph. The oasis had become the undisputed center of gravity for the Eastern world. Zenobia, no longer merely a regent for her son, began to shed the careful facade of subservience. The turning point, the moment the invisible line was truly crossed, occurred not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, dusty workshops of the imperial mints. In the ancient world, the ultimate symbol of supreme authority was not a crown or a throne. It was the ability to strike one's own image onto the currency. For centuries, the silver coins circulating in the markets of Syria and Egypt bore the stern, laurel-wreathed profiles of Roman emperors. But now, as the wealth of her new empire flowed back into Palmyra, Zenobia ordered a change. New coins began to appear in the bazaars and merchant caravans. At first, they bore the face of her son, Vaballathus, alongside the reigning Roman emperor, a subtle assertion of equality. But soon, the Roman emperor vanished entirely from the silver discs. In his place was the regal, unyielding profile of Zenobia herself, crowned with a diadem, the ancient symbol of absolute monarchy. She had named herself Augusta Empress. To hold one of those newly minted coins was to hold a piece of profound psychological weight. It was a declaration that the old world order was dead, and a new sun had risen from the sands of Syria. It is a deeply human flaw to mistake a temporary peak for a permanent foundation. The citizens of Palmyra, walking their grand colonnaded streets, watching the endless caravans bring tribute from conquered lands, felt a sense of absolute invincibility. They believed their walls of limestone and their armies of iron had elevated them above the turbulent currents of history. They believed the Roman giant was finally, permanently asleep. But the tragedy of ambition is that it often blinds us to the subtle shifts in the weather. When you stand on the highest peak of a mountain, surrounded by the thin, cold air of absolute power, it is easy to forget that the ground beneath you is steep and treacherous. The illusion of permanence is the most dangerous mirage of all. Far to the west, beyond the Mediterranean Sea, the crisis of the 3rd century was finally producing a different kind of leader. His name was Aurelian. He was not a soft aristocrat born into purple robes. He was a hardened, ruthless soldier from the rugged provinces of Illyria. He had spent his entire life marching through mud and blood, holding the crumbling borders of the empire together with sheer, brutal discipline. He had just finished stabilizing the western provinces, crushing rebellions, and driving barbarian tribes back across the frozen rivers of Europe. Now, his weary, battle-hardened legions were turning their faces toward the rising sun. The giant was not dead. It was merely wounded, and it was now wide awake, fueled by a cold, calculating fury. The silent rebellion of the desert queen had finally summoned the storm, and as the wind began to howl through the narrow passes of the Taurus Mountains, carrying the distant, rhythmic marching of Roman hobnailed boots, the fragile, golden dream of Palmyra was about to be tested against the unforgiving anvil of history. Emperor Aurelian was a man forged in the brutal, freezing winters of the Danubian frontier. He had no patience for the delicate diplomacy of the East, and he had no appreciation for the exquisite silk that draped the nobles of Palmyra. To him, the desert queen was not a sovereign. She was an infection in the body of the empire, and he was the iron scalpel sent to cut it out. His march across Asia Minor and into the Levant was not merely a military campaign. It was a relentless, inexorable force of nature. Those hot winds carrying dust over the towering walls of Palmyra were no longer just the breath of the desert. They carried the heavy, suffocating scent of approaching doom. The sky above the oasis remained a brilliant, unblemished blue, but everyone trapped within the city knew that the darkest storm in their history was gathering just beyond the horizon. Aurelian's strategy was brutally efficient. He did not engage in pointless skirmishes. He marched his hardened, disciplined legions straight through the scorching heat, crushing any resistance in his path. The brilliant, heavily armored Palmyrene cavalry, the very pride of Zenobia's empire, met the Romans on the plains of Ime and again near Emesa. But Aurelian was a master tactician. He knew the immense weight of the cataphract armor was their greatest weakness beneath the blinding Syrian sun. He ordered his light cavalry to feign retreat, drawing the heavily burdened Palmyrenes into an exhausting chase across the burning sands. When the desert heat had essentially boiled the riders inside their iron shells, when their massive horses were foaming at the mouth and stumbling from utter exhaustion, the Romans turned and struck. The invincible dream of the desert empire shattered in a single afternoon. Zenobia and the remnants of her broken army had no choice but to retreat behind the massive limestone walls of Palmyra. The city that had once been the open, welcoming heart of global trade suddenly snapped its gates shut, transforming into a gilded cage. The siege of Palmyra had begun. If you are listening to the quiet rhythm of your own breathing right now, imagine how the air inside that besieged city must have felt. It grew heavier with each passing day. The sweet, bubbling water of the Efka spring continued to flow, but the grand banquet ceased. The delicate Roman glass vessels were put away, replaced by the grim reality of rationing. The beautiful, colonnaded streets, once bustling with merchants haggling over spices and pearls, were now eerily empty, haunted only by the rhythmic, terrifying thud of Roman siege engines launching massive stones against the defensive walls. Every impact sent a deep, physical shudder through the earth, a constant reminder that time was running out. As the weeks dragged on, the opulent wealth of Palmyra proved completely useless. You cannot eat gold, and you cannot drink silver. The arrogance of supreme power slowly gave way to the quiet, desperate gnawing of starvation. In the dead of night, as the Roman campfires glowed like a constellation of angry red stars surrounding the city, Queen Zenobia, made her final, fateful decision. The woman who had dared to claim the title of empress, who had challenged the master of the known world, realized that her city was lost. But she refused to surrender. Under the cover of profound darkness, a small, heavily veiled group slipped through a hidden postern gate. Zenobia mounted a swift dromedary camel, a creature perfectly adapted to the silent, brutal endurance of the wasteland. Her goal was the Euphrates River, where she hoped to cross into the territory of the Sassanid Persians and beg her former enemies for an army to save her city. The flight across the desert was a masterpiece of desperation. Imagine the cold night air rushing past her face, the frantic, irregular breathing of the camel, the terrifying, absolute silence of the vast emptiness around her. Every shadow looked like a Roman patrol. Every gust of wind sounded like the clashing of swords. She rode with the exhausting, heavy weight of a dying empire pressing down upon her shoulders. She was so close. She could almost smell the damp, fertile mud of the Euphrates riverbank in the distance. She reached the water. The boats were waiting, but the Roman light cavalry had been tracking her. Just as she was preparing to step into the boat, just as the phantom hope of salvation seemed within her grasp, the Roman horsemen emerged from the darkness. There was no grand final battle. There was no dramatic duel. There was only the quiet, crushing realization of absolute defeat. Zenobia, the fierce queen of the East, was captured on the banks of the river that had witnessed the birth of human civilization. When Aurelian finally breached the walls of Palmyra, the punishment was absolute. The city was stripped of its immense wealth. But the most profound tragedy was reserved for the queen herself. When Emperor Aurelian returned to Rome to celebrate his magnificent triumph, he brought the world with him. And walking behind his chariot, enduring the deafening, humiliating roars of the Roman mob, was Zenobia. But Aurelian, recognizing her extraordinary spirit, did not bind her in iron. Instead, in a stroke of exquisite, cruel irony, he had her bound in chains, forged from her own solid gold. The chains were so unimaginably heavy that a Roman slave had to walk beside her just to help support the weight. She walked through the dust of Rome, physically crushed beneath the very wealth that had fueled her ambition. Her golden dream had literally become her prison. Back in the Syrian desert, the Romans eventually returned to Palmyra, but this time they did not come to conquer. They came to erase. The grand temples were looted, the statues of the merchant princes were smashed, and the magnificent colonnades were toppled. The bride of the desert was abandoned to the wind and the sand, transforming from the center of the world into a silent, forgotten ghost town. If you were to travel to the heart of the Syrian desert tonight and stand alone beneath the vast, indifferent canopy of 1 billion stars, you would find what remains of the bride of the desert. The grand colonnades, once bustling with the chaotic energy of global trade, now lie broken and scattered. The towering limestone pillars, which once echoed with the languages of 100 different nations, are now silent, bleached bone white by the relentless sun and smoothed by the nocturnal winds. The air is profoundly still. The scent of roasting meats, exotic spices, and sweet jasmine has long since vanished, replaced only by the crisp, clean scent of ancient dust and cold stone. It is a peaceful, haunting kind of beauty, a beauty born not of creation but of ultimate surrender. When we read the history of Palmyra, it is easy to assign blame. We might judge Queen Zenobia for her blinding, fatal ambition, or condemn Emperor Aurelian for his cold, unyielding brutality. But history, when viewed from the quiet vantage point of centuries, is rarely a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is simply the story of human nature, playing out its inevitable cycles of birth, growth, decay, and death. Zenobia was not wrong to desire freedom for her people. Aurelian was not wrong to fight for the survival of his fracturing world. They were simply two incredibly powerful forces colliding in the dark, both desperately trying to build something permanent in a universe that only tolerates the temporary. Think about the immense weight of those golden chains that bound the Queen of the East. She believed that wealth and power could elevate her above the vulnerability of being human. But in the end, the very things she hoarded became the instruments of her suffering. It is a profound, quiet lesson whispered by the ruins. No empire, no matter how vast its borders, no matter how thick its walls or how heavy its armor, can ever conquer time. Time is the ultimate conqueror. It does not use siege engines or flaming arrows. It simply waits. It waits for the iron to rust, for the gold to lose its meaning, and for the proudest monuments to crumble back into the earth from which they were carved. As you lie there, safe and warm in your own sanctuary, consider the burdens you have carried with you today. Think of the stresses, the endless responsibilities, the petty conflicts, and the quiet anxieties that make your shoulders tense and your mind race. We all build our own little empires of worry. We all construct walls to protect our fragile egos. But stand, in your mind's eye, amidst the silent ruins of Palmyra, look up at the eternal, unchanging stars that once looked down upon Roman legions and desert queens. In the grand, sweeping tapestry of existence, our daily struggles are so incredibly small. They are no heavier than a single grain of sand blowing across a forgotten courtyard. They do not define you, and they certainly do not have to consume your night. The desert has long forgiven the ambitions of Zenobia. It has forgiven the cruelty of Rome. It has gently, patiently buried all of their fury and their glory beneath a blanket of soft, cooling sand. The earth has reclaimed its own, and the universe has returned to its quiet, peaceful equilibrium. It is time for you to do the same. Let go of the golden chains of your own making. You do not need to carry the weight of tomorrow, just as you cannot change the history of yesterday. The only thing that truly exists is this present moment, this quiet breath, this gentle descent into rest. Allow the muscles in your face to completely soften. Let your hands fall open, releasing whatever invisible burdens you are still holding onto. Feel the comforting weight of your blanket, grounding you in the safety of the present. Listen to the silence. It is not an empty silence, but a rich, ancient peace. Let the distant, imagined sound of the desert wind wash away the final traces of your waking thoughts. Close your eyes completely. Surrender to the comforting darkness. You are safe. You are at peace. Sleep now, and let the ancient whispering sands keep watch over your dreams. Good night, and we will meet again in the echoes of another time.